So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay, and this is almost certainly the last time we will see this version of MORIA in the game. I did think the last time was going to be that, because I do know that there is going to be a revamped version of MORIA being given out with the new patch, but this one was sent to me by 2 times, and considering the fact that it is part of the backlog, I did want to get round to it eventually, and I have, although he did send it to me in the midst, really, of all of those custom scenarios we were getting through, so it did get pushed onto the back burner for a little while, because we have seen this map, of course, several times in the past, both directly and indirectly, because it has made up part of other maps, but this is the classic variant of MORIA. 2 sides to defend, with the attacking armies coming from both ways, trying to meet up here in the middle near Balin's tomb. And it is going to be the Misty Mountains who are going to be making up the entirety of the defence today, as the Forces of Good try to wrest back control of Khazad-Dum from them. And very often we do see the Forces of Good on the defence here, because it is a very, I guess, a fun map to play on if you're the Forces of Good with a very high quality army. Because of its more choke pointy nature, although the numbers of the Misty Mountains and some of the tools they have at their disposal could make this pretty difficult for the attackers, honestly, to work their way through. But it is a 3v5. If nothing else, the Misty Mountains won't be overwhelmed in terms of sheer numbers quite so easily by a force that's going to be on the attack against them. But even so, 3v5, you have to give the natural advantage to the force of 5 in every situation there. And here he is, 2 times himself, is going to be playing as Arthedain, stood right in front of one side of the Dwarven settlement. And he's going to have to attack down the route where 2 armies are going to be moving rather than 3, so this is the harder task. Arthedain are a good all-rounder faction. They do lack a little bit in terms of overall infantry quality, which may be a little bit of a concern here in comparison at least to some of the other more quality-centric factions. But Arthedain do have a lot of utility, and they also have a lot of range support. The Arthedain marksman with the armour upgrade here represents a challenge potentially for the Misty Mountains. If it does get bogged down into a skirmish fight, if the attackers can get established within the walls somewhere and they can start shooting into the goblin positions, this is exactly the sort of unit which could end up being a bit of a problem for them, because they can't easily counter skirmish without using something which is significantly more important to their defensive efforts, like their crossbows, but we'll get onto that in just a moment. The Dunedain units, the Dunedain Peacekeepers, are a very good choice here. They may be vulnerable to, again, stuff like the crossbows or javelins potentially that the Misty Mountains can employ, but in terms of sheer melee, there's not much outside of the really high-end goblin units that will really want to go up against the Dunedain Peacekeepers, because they can mow their way through more quantity-focused armies that are a little bit less focused on overall melee defense with the extra damage their axes do. So a good choice, this. Definitely the sort of thing which against the likes of the goblins is going to be very effective. Some armour upgraded Arthedain pikemen. It remains to be seen if they can get themselves established without getting shot up. That is always one of the challenges you do face as an attacker. If you can commit pikes at the right time, it can make life very, very difficult for the defenders, because it means that they can start losing ground in a melee fight that they would hope their quality would be enough to give them a significant edge in. But if you can take that away from them with pikes as the attackers, it makes their life much, much more difficult. But for this very reason, pikes are very often one of the first ports of call for the defenders to try and shoot. And even using stuff like crossbows on them wouldn't be too much of a waste considering their value. Some dismounted Fornosterine Knights, kind of similar to the Dunedain Peacekeepers we've already seen, in the sense that against the rank and file goblins they will be fantastic. Heavy swordsmen like this with their high base damage and high melee defense. All round, they should be pretty damn good at that sort of thing. They don't have a shield, which could be a little bit of a concern if projectiles come their way in high numbers, but they've got good armour anyway, so they fill kind of the same role, really. Got some dismounted Knights of Illuminus, which is where the general is. Very tanky unit of sword and board bodyguard infantry. Of all the bodyguard unit types, this is probably the most unremarkable. They're just solid, really. They're going to do decently against basic units as well. There aren't too many of them, but their tankiness means they're going to survive for a long time, provided they're properly supported, and they should be. Arthedain have got plenty of units over here to give them a hand. Wardens of the North, on the other hand, are more aggressive, certainly at range with those armour-piercing arrows they have loosed from their steel bows, but also in melee with their two-handed swords. Now, they aren't going to be as tanky as the Knights of Illuminus we've already seen, but still, another Dunedain class unit which has got a very multifaceted nature indeed. Several units have fully upgraded Arthedain men-at-arms, so 2 times has gone for a lot of armour upgrades here to try and make his units as efficient as possible, and 1-to-1, this kind of unit from the Western Kingdoms is very often just functional. They're not particularly fantastic in the current meta of the game, generally speaking, but against stuff like the Misty Mountains and regular goblins, this is where units like this can really earn their keep, actually. And we also have some Dunedain Troll Slayers over here as well. Not too surprising to see them. The armor piercing will be very useful against some of the stronger units the Misty Mountains have to offer, both at range and in melee. Fantastic unit, pretty expensive, and when they have to advance into the lion's jaws, so to speak, on this occasion, they could be a little bit more vulnerable than you would like, but still, not too surprising to see them. And civilians pushing up the ram to round out the army. The support that Arthedain will be getting over here is going to be from the team trying to reclaim their ancient home. We have Leech playing as the dwarves of Khazad-Dum, so on the attack they're going to have a little bit less money to spend, but still you would imagine some quality throughout. Not so much with the dwarven miners, fairly cheap for a dwarven unit. The armor piercing, as we've already mentioned, will be useful, especially against the more basic goblin units against which the dwarven miners should be able to come out on top, but not going to be too great at marching into prepared defences. This is a good opportunity perhaps for the dwarves to showcase how efficient their regular units can be, and the warriors of Khazad-Dum shouldn't have too many issues in that regard. Easily going to be able to defeat the equivalent Misty Mountains units. Only really the higher tier and obviously very high tier units for the Misty Mountains will easily be able to defeat the stuff like the warriors of Khazad-Dum, but they do offer a little bit more than the Arthedain Man-at-Arms that we've already seen. We've already mentioned pikes. The sentries of Khazad-Dum are going to be filling really the same sort of role the Arthedain pikemen did already. I would say the sentries are slightly the superior unit, though maybe with the armour upgrade it's far closer than I would assume, and given the fact that most pikes tend to have stats that are relatively low, it's more their formation that does most of the heavy lifting. That is worth bearing in mind, so they will fill pretty much the same role. Armour upgraded 3rd Legion is a fairly expensive investment, but quality is one thing that the Khazad-Dum dwarves can bring on this occasion, and with the utility of Arthedain it makes for an interesting partnership, though we do worry a little bit in terms of the sustainability of their attack if they end up sustaining a lot of losses. We have some 4th Legion Shield Guard here as well. Nice heavy unit of spears. A couple of units of Hammers of Gundabad. Locked Morale could end up being very useful actually, and very necessary if these attackers come under sustained pressure. We have some Khazad-Dum Reclaimers. Throwing axes in the confines of Moria can be really, really good if you get them into the right position, and actually the terrain may work against the Misty Mountains a little bit somewhere if they decide to deploy on a hill, because that will give the Reclaimers just that little bit easier of a shot. The armor-piercing 1st Legion pikes could be devastating in the late game, one of the things the Misty Mountains need to deal with at range really, because if they're still alive come the late game it's going to be almost impossible to bring them down at that point. And we also have some guards of Khazad-Dum and Mithril Guard, so the 3 hit point unit and the armor-piercing unit both in tow. Now then, over on the other side, they will have to wait a long time before they can meet up with Medexa, who's playing as Cardolan, another of the Arnorian petty kingdoms. We've got some Minhiriath spearmen. I would assume that we're going to be seeing a fair amount, well, certainly a more high numbers approach here. And Cardolan are one of the good factions, good line factions, I should say, that are capable of laying on rather large armies. The Minhiriath spears and men-at-arms blanketed throughout the army are decent enough. Their armour will help them. Lower morale of Cardolan in general could be a bit of a concern if they end up getting into a bit of a mosh pit against the Misty Mountains, though the goblins themselves may also struggle in that regard. Bandits are in and amongst, again, more cheap pikes in the Greenway Garrison footman. Pikes could very well prove to be one of the keys for the attackers here. And also having Cardolan along means that you're not allowing a monopoly on crossbows for the defenders here. Cardolan have got a better crossbow selection than the Misty Mountains, so the fact that they're having to be on the attack means they're going to have to put them more readily in harm's way. We shall see how that goes for them. Greenway Garrison Spearmen are in here as well. Melee stats, or at least their ability to deal damage in melee, is very, very low. Spears, pretty much one of the lowest damaging units in the game, but reasonably tanky, especially at range, so they can be an interestingly useful part of a Cardolan push, but only if they're supported properly, otherwise morale issues may start to rear their ugly heads. And then Manatar Ramen Gatekeepers with the armour upgrade as well, so the stronger unit of crossbows here. Looks like a couple of units of them as well, and that's probably going into the red limit, which I actually think maybe is the right thing to do for Cardolan here, going for a pure support role, leaving the heavy lifting to be done by another Khazad-Dum army here with Diego Rio Ramos front and centre, with warriors of Khazad-Dum once more pushing up a ram. Just in behind, yet more warriors of Khazad-Dum in a big long line. He too has got the locked morale of the Hammers of Gundabad to fall back on, might be necessary if his Cardolan support runs for the hills. Sons of the Fallen is something we didn't see before, a unit of upper end spears They will also stay fighting for a long period of time, though not with the same damage dealing potential as the hammers, but they will do a better job at keeping themselves alive. Guards of Khazad-Dum we already mentioned, Mithril Guard we already mentioned, armor piercing and 3 hit points respectively. He's also got the standard bodyguard unit that Khazad-Dum have in the Legion bodyguard. This is a very expensive investment though. With the first Legion pikes as well, I'm not sure I can get behind the idea of going full quality with the dwarves here. You're going to need numbers, otherwise you're playing as the attackers with a numbers deficit on the defenders, which is risky. It means that you're really backing yourself to get an ideal position to attack from. If you don't, you're in massive trouble. All kinds of Khazad-Dum are in here, and Khazad-Dum as well, so they do have range support, but I don't know, we'll see. Could end up being a bit dicey, that. And last, but by no means least, we have Imladris, played by Addin Men, up here on the hill. Looks like another high-quality army. That's always the temptation when you've got armies like Khazad-Dum and Imladris on the attack. More armour piercing in the Gwaith Imladris, formerly the Smiths of Eregion way back when. Very dangerous, of course, one of the best units of armour piercing shock infantry the game has to offer. Arthedain warriors offering some elven pressure at range, though lighter armour means the Misty Mountains could make the most of their positioning advantage to try and win that. Eldrenway archers, it will be less cut and dry to do that because of their heavier armour. More Imladris Guardians. God Helim are in here. We've got some Eldrenway Spearmen. We've got some Gwaith Arthedain, Imladris Guardians, pretty much in a big old cluster here. But yeah, Eldrenway units, upper end units, and the only lighter Elven units we're seeing are the Norotino warriors, which will add some pressure at range, but also will get involved in melee later on as well. I think there's a unit of Archers of Rivendell in there as well, so an interesting force. We'll see. Quality focus for the attackers in all armies, really, except for Cardolan. Is that going to bite them when they come to deal with the veritable nest of goblins and monsters that we find within the confines of Moria? Tumihai being one of the defenders, heavy goblin spears, a must-bring really. All of the attackers, to one extent or another, are going to have some reliance on armour, and the heavy goblin spears are by far and away the Misty Mountains' best frontline combatant. Spears, of course, are naturally a little bit more defensively orientated, and the armour piercing means they're not going to suffer from the spear malice that they have. They are still a regular unit of goblins though, so don't expect miracles from them, even if those little bits of extra efficiency are nice. Drake Broodlings are more of an aggressive unit, so utilising them at the right time is going to be key if they're going to be worthwhile bringing, because it's quite expensive to bring a unit like the Drake Broodlings, in all honesty. Heavy Goblin Spears once again. We have the Heavy Goblin Archers, so the Misty Mountains Archer selection is obviously not brilliant, but in a situation like this I don't think you can get away with bringing no archers at all, otherwise you are opening yourself up for the attackers to simply try and skirmish you down, play the long game, and 40k frames is fairly long for a battle, but not super long. We have seen longer battles on this very map before, so I assume it's not going to be a skirmishing slugfest, and that may, in part, that will be because the Misty Mountains have decided to at least contest that. It will force the attackers to be a little bit more proactive in that regard. Plenty of archers. We've seen the Black Uruks of the Mountains actually be surprisingly effective. Maybe not surprisingly effective, but they've proven their worth for the Misty Mountains in terms of their high quality, their greater ability to deal damage. They will be up against it here, though, with the quality that Imladris and Khazad-Dum have to offer, but perhaps with the numbers around them that we can see, maybe they will be in a good place. Already mentioned how the heavy goblin crossbows will be important. I think they may very well be the key to the Misty Mountains' defence. If they can bottle the attackers up, shoot up their quality-focused armies with some sustained crossbow fire, the attackers could be in all sorts of trouble, and they could be made to pay for their greed when it comes to high-tier units. Or, if the crossbows cannot get good shots off, that quality could be enough to mow their way through the goblins slowly but surely until victory is achieved. More Black Uruks, we've got some more heavy goblin spears. The Mountain Uruk host represent, and Darth playing another of the Misty Mountains armies on the defence. The Mountain Uruk host represents an upper end unit of line infantry by the Misty Mountain standards, similar, as I often say, to the Uruk High Infantry, because that's a good barometer for their quality. So yeah, they're going to be able to withstand more punishment, but again, considering the quality they're up against, it's not going to be enough to get outright victory. It's going to have to be a combined effort. They've got more crossbows. Something like the White Uruk Fearmongers will concern the attackers. Pikes can, of course, outrange them, but the Fearmongers are still going to be very, very dangerous, especially to forces like the Dwarves. If they can get bottled up and the Fearmongers can do some damage in melee and they're supported properly, this could be a good situation for them to be in. Goblin King's Bodyguard, as we've already mentioned, sword and board bodyguard units tend to be the least interesting. The Dwarves actually have probably got the most interesting selection of this kind of unit. The Goblin King's Bodyguard, though, are a fairly numerous one, and we have seen them perform well in tournaments in the past. Mountain Eric host once again. Some Blackback Mountain Berserkers over on this side with more crossbows. Of course, the Blackbacks by far and away the most dangerous melee combatant for the Misty Mountains when it comes to dealing damage, though they do have a tendency to fall away after a certain point, so you cannot rely on them too heavily. More Drake Broodlings. This is an expensive investment for the Misty Mountains. As much as we've mentioned already that the high quality approach of the attackers could come back to haunt them, bringing a lot of units like this, which are going to be more difficult to use in Moria's confines, could very well prove to be a significant mistake for the defenders. And let's not forget, it is still a 3v5. It's still all for the defenders to do here. 2 units of Blackbacks with a unit of Goblin King's Bodyguard, already mentioned. The merits of both bodyguard units for the Misty Mountains. And then over here we have got some more Black Uruks, Darthy Darth once again. And Winged Swordsman is the final player on the defence. Good to see him again. Heavy Goblin crossbows in place, ready to fire into the attacks over on this side. Of course, the defenders only have to deal with the 2 armies over here rather than the 3, so we'll see. The Heavy Goblin Infantry is an interesting choice. I mean, you have a little bit more money to spend as the Misty Mountains in this situation, and you're still going with the Heavy Goblin Infantry. In terms of sheer quality, they are not going to net you all that much value, but they will give you numbers and just a little bit of support for some more important units, perhaps. For something like the Mountain Orc Berserkers in front of them, armor piercing, of course, very good against Arthedain and Khazad-Dum. Locked morale as well, so they're one of the few units for the Misty Mountains that will not abandon the fight when things start to turn south, or start to go south, turn sour. Heavy Goblin crossbows once more Heavy Goblin infantry. We've got some Snaga skirmishers. Interesting to, well, strange to not actually see more of the Snaga skirmishers already. They may be cheap javelins, and you may want a little bit more punch as the defenders, but you've got to work with what you're given. In the Misty Mountains, while we're used to seeing them on the attack, today they're going to have to try and utilise such things on the defence. Plenty of crossbows, which we've already mentioned how they could be important. Trolls, something else which we're used to seeing as more of an aggressive unit, but here they're going to have to be deployed to a front line at the right time to do maximum damage to the attackers, and they will actually be useful for chasing off units that are trying to just sort of skirmish and play cat and mouse with the defenders. So that's something, as will the Drake Broodlings, so the trolls are a little bit more generally useful, I think. Blackbacks, Black Uruks of the mountains. We've got the White Uruk Fearmongers in and amongst them. Black Uruks of the mountains once again, and more Heavy Goblin spears. So I'll make a little cut, and we will rejoin when Moria's gates are being battered down, which shouldn't take too long. But yeah, interested to see this one. It's slightly unorthodox and is a pretty neat way to see off this old version of Moria. So yeah, I'll make a cut and we'll rejoin when Khazad-Dum are trying to reclaim their homelands. Well, this caught me a little bit by surprise, as the Snow Trolls and some accompanying Heavy Goblin Spears have decided to counter-attack outside of the gates, and considering it is only a single unit of Arthedain pikemen that are here guarding the ram as it gets pushed forward, that's maybe understandable. Trolls, after all, are one of the better choices for dealing with pikes, and I suspect that with how numbers heavy the Misty Mountains are, and given the compositions of the attackers, I shouldn't be too surprised maybe that the Misty Mountains are prepared to be a little bit more aggressive, maybe turn the tables on the attackers just that little bit more. Dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights, exactly the sort of thing which will be far more useful against this unit of Snow Trolls. So far the Snow Trolls haven't taken too much damage at all, and this will be a good start for the Misty Mountains. Already mentioned how pikes could be one of the things which late game could prove to be a real pain for them. Much more of a traditional start to the battle over on the other side, with the dwarves battering down the gates. But yeah, and one thing that maybe is to be brought into consideration as well is the fact that they will be really reliant on those crossbows, I think, to be that ranged support. Very often when we see the defenders win, especially when the forces of good are on the defence, their very strong ranged units play a big part in that. And while the Misty Mountains maybe have got more manpower to spare in a battle like this, they are still going to need their ranged units to do something to assist them, and only really the Heavy Goblin crossbows are capable of delivering the punch that's truly going to be necessary to make that happen, I think. Now, with some of the trolls retreating, but some of them also dying, coinciding rather neatly with when the dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights have managed to get into position, and as much as the Heavy Goblin Spear's armour piercing will be useful as this battle does wear on, you would definitely back the Heavy Swordsmen of Arthedain to do the business. Not much in the way of pikes left though, only 41 of them, so those trolls did do a good job
forward once again. The Goblin archers already in position, banking up rather nicely. And as most people who have played on this map before, which I think all of these players will have played on MORIA before, actually there's trolls out here as well, so another counter attack, although these guys aren't going to last too long. The rest of their unit was able to retreat, but even if it was just the warriors of Khazad-Dum, it's a less juicy target, so to speak, than the Arthedain pikemen were on the other side. Yeah, with the hammers of Gundabad around, that one isn't going to last too much longer. But as I was saying, the defenders will always bank up so that they're actually having to fight uphill in melee, but it gives you the angle to use your range support really, really nicely in this part of MORIA. And all the goblins need to do is stand in the way and hold the line after all. There's only a few units that are of genuine high quality that the Misty Mountains will be able to rely upon to go toe to toe with the enemy. Speaking of which, the Black Uruks of the Mountains have been pushed forward to help with the fight against Arthedain on this front line, and in response to that, another unit of men-at-arms has also been pushed forward by Arthedain to keep this assault going. But so far so good, I would say, for the Misty Mountains. We are now starting to see the slow but sure arrival of another of the Khazad-Dum armies, and I'm sure a little bit of dwarven grit on this front line is exactly the sort of thing that the Arthedainians will be very appreciative of, given how this battle has started. Although, despite the initial surprise of the trolls and the goblins counter-attacking outside of the gates, Arthedain, I'm sure, will settle into their rhythm now. They are retreating as well, Winged Swordsman, so he's going to try and get his units out of there, not in any immediate danger of routing either, and perhaps seeing the fact that with the pikes arriving on the front line, this counter-attack isn't going to be able to sustain itself unless the snow trolls were committed once again. But with the amount of Arthedain infantry that were here, the snow trolls would not be as universally effective as they were previously. Drake Broodlings maybe still have an opportunity. These heavy goblin spears are shaken, but I think that's because a couple of their number are still actually caught in the melee fighting. But saving 80 heavy goblin spears for later, definitely a worthwhile thing to do. Still going to be interested to see how those Drake Broodlings actually manage to equip themselves in this battle. I don't know how useful they would necessarily be. Meanwhile, Minhiriath sharpshooters are trying to play that game of cat and mouse. The attackers trying to stick their crossbows just into the gates and get a few volleys off. And forward come the Drake Broodlings to run through the Minhiriath sharpshooters. If they slow down for even a moment, given the amount of units that are around them, that will surely be the end of them. They're already shaken after all, and yeah, this will be the end now. They're wavering. Monsters, their animal instinct for survival will be kicking in. Snow trolls following them in, however, as well as some heavy goblin spears. I mean, again, I don't necessarily think that this is as good of an idea as it was on the other side. I do appreciate the aggression the Misty Mountains are employing in this fight so far, though. Hammers of Gundabad doing their thing. Another of the snow trolls does fall. I mean, the heavy goblin spears are moving forward, but against this level of quality, it's going to be difficult for them. And indeed, all of the Drake Broodlings have fallen. So, as I was kind of worried about, that definitely wasn't value for money. I mean, there's a decent amount of dead units out here, but most of them are highly basic in nature, and it wasn't enough of an impact, I would suggest, either. Cave Trolls managing to find a gap and going after the Minhiriath sharpshooters, seeing the danger that the Cardolan crossbows do represent, so not too surprising at all. Cave Trolls also not going to do too well to the Hammers of Gundabad. Indeed, they are actually slightly weaker in sustained melee than the Snow Trolls, but getting in behind enemy lines, going after stuff like the Orc Hunters and the Greenway Garrison Footmen and the Bandits, softer targets which in many ways are more important to get rid of. Any sort of range support like that, you need to try and deprive the attackers of that if you're the Misty Mountains, because once again, we've already mentioned how their crossbows are all well and good, but generally speaking, their own ranged units are not up to the same sort of standard, and the last thing you want to be doing as the defenders is giving the attackers the advantage at range. There are also Khazad-Dum Reclaimers over here though, and they will be far better at defending themselves in melee against trolls with those two-handed axes that they wield. Blood spattered already, these trolls as well. Imladris Guardians pushing their way forwards. That elven quality over on this side of the battlefield is going to be another wrinkle that the Misty Mountains are going to have to deal with as time goes on. Bandits moving forward. Also, being outside the walls like this, we can see that the attackers are already trying to use their archers as well. Flaming shots to take advantage of that spotty Misty Mountains morale. The trolls right in and amongst it again. They'll kill off a few more of these pikes before they fall, but sandwiched as they are between the hammers of Gundabad and Imladris Guardians, I can't imagine they'll last too much longer. Following that, Warriors of Khazad-Dum fighting hard, but they've taken quite a lot of damage. They've been at the forefront of most of this counter-attacking from Misty. Over on this side of the battlefield, all quiet for the time being. This is actually this marks the first time, this one unit of Warriors of Khazad-Dum, that the attackers have actually managed to make it inside Moria. All the fighting up to now has taken place outside of the gates. But now they're going to try and establish themselves, and we'll be seeing maybe a little bit more of a traditional Moria fight from here on. Utilising their crossbows already. The remains of some Arthedain pikemen, the Warriors of Khazad-Dum, and killing off a few of the Arthedain marksmen as well. They need to be a little bit careful, and that is also a little bit of a concern. The gates slamming shut behind them. So they may very well need to batter down the gates once again with some of their units already in and effectively trapped at this point, though if the Misty Mountains were to get close enough to the gates, they would automatically open, so would be, I think, an interesting mechanic if you could open and close the gates as you pleased as the defenders, as long as you still controlled the walls. Drake Broodlings moving forward, and Warriors of Khazad-Dum have already taken a fair amount of damage, and this may very well be the end for them pretty quickly. This expeditionary force could be very short-lived indeed. The Arthedain marksmen doing their best to establish themselves in a long-range fight. Snaga skirmishers their target for now. Drake Broodlings need to keep moving, that is the key here. It's not the kind of unit that you can just park in a battle and they'll do the business. Arthedain marksmen could very well end up routing, and they do. Soft enough target, and the snow trolls moving forward as well, so clearly I think the attackers thought the gates would remain open, but that wasn't the case, and all of these units that they sent in will fall. Another nice little gain for the Misty Mountains. For the most part, I have to say their counter-attacking has done pretty well. Not universally, I'd say that over here it's been a little bit more of a mixed bag for them. Struggled a little bit more to establish themselves. They've done damage, but I would say at best they've broken even value-wise over here. Possibly even lost a little bit of value in a 5v3. The margins are very harsh for you as the defenders. Over on the other side, Khazad-Dum reclaimers some of those throwing axes hitting their own ram, and indeed you can see the throwing axes actually doing an awful lot of damage. It's a lot of wasted ammunition though. You don't even necessarily need to use throwing axes at all in this fight over here. You'll be just fine in melee with the Dwarven and Elven quality backed up by the Cardolan cheap pikes. Actually managed to cease firing. Snaga skirmishers throwing their javelins in still. I have to say, actually, given the pressure that these heavy goblin spears are under, they're actually doing a very good job at holding the line. Spears showcasing their defensive prowess once more. Sharpshooters trying to shoot in behind and going after Mountain Orc Berserkers. One of the more dangerous melee combatants that the Misty Mountains have, I suppose. And once again, it's as you were on the other side. Now the gate will not be able to bamboozle the attackers over there. Bandits on the front line who are not the strongest combatants. Still says victory seems certain for the heavy goblin spears, which I find very difficult to believe given the presence of the hammers and the Imladris Guardians. Yes, against the bandits, well, that's fine, but surely not with this level of pressure that's coming their way. Snaga skirms Heavy Goblin Spears, another unit of them, waiting in the wings. The core of the Goblin defensive effort here, as they should be. And it looks as though they're going to be tempted here, the Misty Mountains, into sending another unit outside the gates. Mountain Orc Berserkers, locked morale as they are, so they will need to be killed to the last man. And also the armour piercing gives them that little bit extra boost against the Dwarven and Elven units on the front. Not enough to make them victorious, but enough to do a little bit of extra damage. Javelin's still moving in. I mean, the Minhiriath Sharpshooters are competent enough in melee that it is a worthwhile unit to try and kill off. Javelins, many of them actually hitting. You can see there the Khazad-Dum Reclaimers throwing their axes and destroying the ram now. And just in behind, Snaga Skirmishers still throwing away. All kinds of Khazad-Dum shooting in behind as well. It's a rare situation for the Forces of Good to be able to shoot Snaga Skirmishers with something like Orc Hunters and not have it be a bit of a waste. Defeat seems certain, only a military genius could win this battle. Which I'm still surprised about. The Mountain Orc Berserkers are all well and good, but I mean there's still 50 Imladris Guardians, there's still 47 Hammers of Gundabad. So I'm not too sure about that one, and there's a little bit of range support as well, meanwhile. The attackers moving in with something a little bit more, well, they routed as well, which is actually quite surprising. 4th Legion Shield Guard, maybe not so much the Dwarven Miners, but overextending themselves. I think they need to send in something a little bit more substantial here, the attackers. They're trying to drip feed their army in, and it's clearly not working. And the Misty Mountains have really been having a pretty good time of it over on this side of the battlefield so far. Still a long way to go, of course, but as the crossbow bolts rip overhead. Dunedain Trollslayer is going to be getting into melee, or well, I say melee. They may be getting into melee if the Drake Broodlings attack once again, but that's an unfortunate loss as well, because that is an awful lot of damage. Fully upgraded unit of 4th Legion Shield Guard is a strong unit as well. I mean, Dunedain Trollslayers being sent out front and centre are obviously going to be a lightning rod for all manner of crossbow bolts, so not sure what 2 times was expecting from that, but still. And so far, the Misty Mountains can be very, very pleased with their day's work over here. An outright victory for the Misty Mountains over here would be extremely good news for them moving into the later period of the game. And one thing that I've always wondered about and what goes through the attacker's mind in this situation, because the defenders aren't going anywhere. You're going to need to consolidate and then make a concerted effort to attack here. There's no way you're going to avoid taking damage at the hands of these crossbows. You already have taken a lot. So, again, it's one of those weird situations for me. But we'll see how it goes. One of the 4th Legion Shield Guard, the banner carrier, skewered by another heavy Goblin Spear. And now they're retreating again. The Drake Broodlings coming forward, and they're going to get caught. Fortunately for them, I guess, their routing Dwarven Miners are actually going to stand in the way. Intentionally or no. Very bizarre situation this, but they're going to need to think of something better than this, the attackers. It's not been a particularly fantastic start to the battle from them over there, and while much of it is to do with the Misty Mountains and how front foot they've been, some of it has been poor play as well, or at least poor decision making. It's kind of difficult to have poor all-round play on a map as simplistic and grindy as Moria. Snaga Skirmishers getting a little bit closer to the action still. Snaga Skirmishers are not going to do damage at a huge pace, but it is starting to add up now. Some damage being done to the Noritiano warriors. Heavy Goblin Spears and the Mountain Orc Berserkers still fighting, and I don't know if another unit of Heavy Goblin Spears was committed or not, but the Misty Mountains seem to be punching well above their weight class here in melee, doing a very, very good job. As much as it hasn't been as cut and dry with how well the Misty Mountains have done over here compared to on the other side, it's been far from a defeat for them. At the very least, they're fighting the attackers to a standstill. And so far, the Dwarven quest to reclaim Khazad-Dum is very much up in the air. Tumahai's units look like they may end up routing though, with a bit of extra pressure, with more warriors of Khazad-Dum, overwhelming numbers coming forward from Cardolan as well. That could be enough to take advantage of that weak morale that the Misty Mountains do suffer from. Victory is almost a certainty. There are Legion Bodyguard in and amongst there as well, so with that extra extremely high quality, which the dwarves have invested a lot of their budget into, so they need it to be doing good things for them, and surely it will be enough for them to finally gain passage into the settlement proper. What about over on the other side then? Once again, pushed completely out of the settlement. I always look at it as a noticeable negative when the attackers have got nothing going on really. They're not maintaining any sort of assault, they're not pushing the defenders back, they are merely waiting. They do still have a lot in reserve, so it's not as if with their failure of an attack before it's crippled their efforts moving forward completely, but I do wonder what they're thinking now, because again, there's no need for the winged swordsman to do anything. Simply wait for the opportune moment. Drake Broodlings have been used very well actually throughout the fight so far. The ones over here maybe less so, but over on the other side the Drake Broodlings have actually proven to be a good addition. Charging forward once more, bulldozing through. Yeah, they do end up routing though, it's not too surprising, that is a problem with them. But yeah, they've been really useful to disrupt any sort of flow the attackers have wanted to get into. And once again, the Misty Mountains are going to prevent the attackers over here from marching in through the gates. Another unit of heavy goblin spears committed forwards. Legion bodyguards still here with more units arriving in support as well. Greenway Garrison footmen and spearmen from Cardolan to offer the anchor and a few more numbers. But what do the attackers do from here? Mountain Orc Berserkers, the target of the Orc Hunter's attention. Again, they're very low armour scores, make them a very, very tempting target. Pikes, if they can get themselves into position, and along with the high quality of the Legion Bodyguard, that would surely be enough to finally start pushing the Misty Mountains onto the back foot permanently. And this little fight for the gatehouse, but so far the Misty Mountains are all too happy to keep sending reinforcements forward, more Snarger skirmishers to act as a supporting role. Meanwhile, I mean, once again, we're seeing a unit of Arthedain men-at-arms rout from the field. They need something more substantial on this front line. If they make this mistake over and over again, they've got truly no one but themselves to blame. Drake Broodlings, the Pikes will do a good job at dealing with the Drake Broodlings, and then the extra damage of the Hammers of Gundabad as well. Another unit of Arthedain men-at-arms to try and bulk up the numbers on the front line. The other unit that was already here did not do a particularly fantastic job. The Blackback Mountain Berserkers being committed as well, so some really high quality. That sort of damage is exactly the sort of thing which will make for a good foe for the Hammers of Gundabad to try and get their teeth into, but the Blackbacks should be victorious here. Snarger skirmishers acting in the supporting role for the goblins on the front line. Black Uruks are nearby as well, so the Misty Mountains have got options, but at the very least the attackers are starting to place the defenders under a little bit more pressure once again. Arthedain marksman. Heavy goblin crossbows are also starting to fire, with a little bit more here. I mean, the Arthedain marksman probably not worth going after, but the Khazad-Dum reclaimers are, and you can see that that is what the Misty Mountains are targeting down. Dangerous with their throwing axes certainly, and also potentially a problematic unit in melee as well, so when you have that combination you want to be trying to get rid of them if it's all possible. Blackback Mountain Berserkers burrowing into enemy lines. I don't know whether this is necessarily the best of ideas. While they're doing this, they're going to be having swipes taken at them from the Hammers of Gundabad, and that level of damage is not the sort of thing which is going to be conducive to their continued existence. And you can see that their numbers did fall a little bit there. Falling by quite a lot as well. Maybe the first misstep that the Misty Mountains on this side have actually made. Flaming shot being used on the heavy goblin crossbows. Pressure being turned up by the attackers, maybe trying to make up for their earlier errors. And of course the attackers in a 5v3 have always got more leeway than the defenders, even when the Misty Mountains with their extra numbers are on the defence. Snaga, Black Uruks once again, the Drake Broodlings coming forward. They're starting to look a little bit more thin on the ground now than they were. Sentries of Khazad-Dum routing. So the pikes that were the main problem for them previously, no longer an issue. The Snow Trolls as well. Really good use of the Drake Broodlings and the Snow Trolls from Winged Swordsmen so far, and backing up the front line now as well with a bit of extra quality from the Black Uruks of the mountains, so the Misty Mountains will hold on for longer. Plenty of reinforcements as well. I do worry for the Misty Mountains when their infantry starts to fall away and their support starts to run out of ammunition, because I mean you can see these crossbows have already run out of ammo. Committing heavy goblin crossbows to melee is not going to do much in terms of kills. It's just going to be more warm bodies on the front line. Meanwhile, what have we over here? Still the Misty Mountains holding on to the front line. They're just about now getting in through the gates. So they will at least see the inside of Khazad-Dum. Whether they go on to be victorious here, the dwarves, remains to be seen. But there is still the Goblin King's bodyguard to deal with. I'm not sure I would have committed forward them on their own, because with the dwarven bodyguard and all the support, the Goblin King's bodyguard aren't going to be able to hold on for too much longer. They're a very functional unit, but still. And now also starting to see the line be so thin that some dwarves are simply wandering through it. Some warriors of Khazad-Dum managing to make that happen. They may live to regret that decision with some Black Uruks on the way, but it's a sign that at least the initial defensive line is being completely overcome fairly efficiently. Black Uruks of the mountains. One unit of them is probably not going to be enough to turn the fortunes of the Misty Mountains around on this front line, but another obstacle for the attackers to overcome. The presence of those Cardolan pikes, I can't help but feel like, is going to be a very useful thing for their front line. Meanwhile, more dwarves arriving now. Looking a little bit again with part of the front line being manned exclusively by Snaga skirmishers. That's the sort of thing which you look at and notice significant weak aspects to a front line. And Snaga skirmishers having to take on upgraded 3rd Legion infantry is definitely an example of that. Heavy Goblin crossbows having to bank their shots a little bit, but it will continue to do some decent damage. And over here at least, with crossbow bolts hitting the dwarven pikes and the melee unit being Black Uruks of the mountains and what remains of the Blackbacks, only 24 of them remain. Surprised that they were committed on their lonesome to try and hold the front line really for any length of time, but they did what they could. Heavy Goblin crossbows still with ammunition left to them, though not much you'd have to say by this point. And maybe that's the key. The dwarves and Arthedain on this side have yet to commit their real heavy hitters, but you could argue that the Misty Mountains still have some good stuff in reserve as well. Quite your Fearmongers. They still have some trolls, more Black Uruks, so they're far from defenceless, but as I mentioned, the Misty Mountains will be reliant on their crossbows to a certain extent, and to deal with the upper echelon of especially the Khazad-Dum units, they may very well need those crossbows. If they don't have access to them, things could get pretty ugly. In come the Drake Broodlings, bulldozing through the back of their own units. Some heavy goblin crossbows trying to help shore things up in melee. Like I said, not exactly the match winners in this sort of situation. Goblin crossbows still banking their shots. Still a fair way in this battle to go. We're at more or less the halfway point, just beyond it. And so far, the attackers have not made too much progress through the map at all. Part of that can be explained by the Misty Mountains' early counterattacks and establishing themselves outside of the settlement, but as the battle has gone on, the attackers have been, you know, taking their time, which is not necessarily the wrong thing to do, but it does mean that you have to back yourself in terms of longevity with many of your units. See if you can see it out in that way. Blackback Mountain Berserkers, victory seems certain. Only a fool could lose this battle. And here he has sharpshooters. Ammunition sailing overhead. Blackback's over here though. I mean, arriving too late, it would seem to help back up the Goblin King's bodyguard, who seemed to have been killed to the last man, but alongside the Black Uruks, the level of damage which is coming the attackers' way now, too much for them to bear, it seems, and the attackers, they don't really want their attack to come completely a cropper. They're going to need to send forward some more reinforcements, and with 3 armies over here, you'd have to suggest they should have enough in the tank to make that happen, but as we go overhead, there's still plenty of goblins consolidated around the town centre that can be committed should the need arise. Dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights, more Hammers of Gundabad on the way forward now as well, so slowly but surely the attackers are starting to make progress. Some of the higher quality units are now gone, and you know, heavy goblin infantry has been committed forward to try and hold back the tide, but that's not going to last for too much longer. I mean, those crossbows doing what they can, but the Dunedain Troll Slayers trying to diffuse that particular problem. Still more crossbow bolts coming in, still being the supporting unit that they need to be, but with pikes and with shock infantry from both the dwarves and men, more basic infantry flooding forwards as well, and the level of quality for the Misty Mountains on the front line looking far more suspect now. There is an opportunity here for the attackers to really double down on this, I think, and force the Misty Mountains onto the back foot, maybe force them to retreat to all the way to the town centre over on this side of the battlefield. After all, it is a little bit more open, but Misty Mountains, they are committing forward more. I mean, they're committing forward pretty much everything they have down here, so they're going to double down on trying to defend from the front. Some Mountain Orc Berserkers, some White Uruk Fearmongers, but this is really the last time they're going to be able to put a significant obstacle in the way of the attackers, so they need to hope that it's enough almost to gain at least a Pyrrhic victory defensively over here, as well as the Winged Swordsman has played in this battle so far, because he was only up against 2 armies, whereas there are 3 over on the other side. This was one of the battles which, or the side of the battle that the Misty Mountains would have been looking at and thinking, we need to be winning it really, and so far done very, very well, but Khazad-Dum Reclaimers getting hit by crossbow bolts as they whistle overhead. The extra armour piercing certainly won't go amiss, and they're going to need to commit forward another wave here, the attackers, otherwise they could end up coming unstuck. The White Uruks on the front now doing the business. Heavy Goblin infantry as well. Over here, meanwhile, early on I feel as though the Misty Mountains were maybe making a few more missteps, but actually less progress has been made overall over here, and I think part of that is down to the attackers taking the slower approach. Committing forward a unit of warriors of Khazad-Dum when you know that what's in melee are Blackback Mountain Berserkers and Black Uruks is another example of a questionable decision, because you know that the warriors left to their own devices are going to lose that fight, and hemorrhaging more of your manpower is the sort of thing that you can scarcely afford at this point in proceedings. But we shall see how things develop. Still support from the crossbows. I mean, just having a look out here, they do still have a fair amount in reserve, plenty of the regulars from Cardolan, obviously the crossbows still, but getting into position for attacking crossbows we've already seen has been fairly difficult for Cardolan with their Minhiriath units. Plenty of the high tier Khazad-Dum units as well, and Imladris still have some high quality too, but that maybe their saving grace, the fact that they have taken this slower approach, means that they will be able to send forward a potential hammer blow in the late game that the Misty Mountains, with how much effort they've had to put into proceedings already, they may not be able to withstand it. But we shall see. The Goblin crossbows moving forwards, a couple of them. Meanwhile, what about over here? Dunedain Troll Slayers in melee, going to be pretty nasty. The Mountain Orc Berserkers won't mind too much at dealing with another heavy axe unit, but all of the other goblins that are over here will not like the armour piercing that's going to be coming their way. Still the Drake Broodlings being used. Keeping them moving is the key, and Winged Swordsman has been especially adept at that. Unit of Arthedain Man-at-Arms moving forward once again. Some more very appreciated, I'm sure, numbers. The frontline First Legion Pikes is a really significant unit to bring forwards now as well. Unsurprisingly, the crossbows targeting them down first and foremost. 3rd Legion Infantry marching in step with them as well, because First Legion Pikes take away really a good chunk of the effectiveness that the White Orc Fearmongers are going to have been laying down on the front line so far as well. He's clearly been rationing his ammunition quite well here, the Winged Swordsman, because still having access to some of it in spite of the fact we've been seeing it pretty much under constant use is important. The Wardens of the North, meanwhile, now trying to fire back in return as well. It will do some good in terms of lowering that DPS, but having to use armour-piercing arrows on crossbows is the sort of thing which usually Arthedain would probably not be engaging in, but here it is. 3rd Legion Infantry causing a rout from the Heavy Goblin Infantry, and now with that gap, with the crossbows now open to attack, is that the significant moment? Those Heavy Goblin crossbows may very well be out of ammunition as they do lurch forward, and just trying to get into as many units of these crossbows as possible. The Cave Trolls moving in as well. Decent amount of damage off the charge there. What remains of very few Dunedain Troll Slayers left after their exertions on the front line. Do they have more units that can be committed forward? Because the 3rd Legion Infantry there, they've done the right thing by moving forward and trying to engage the back lines, but the reinforcements are too far away, and as a result I really do think they're going to end up routing here with Blackbacks and Cave Trolls and yeah, all those numbers. So the Misty Mountains once again recovering from a potentially sticky situation there very nicely. Dunedain Troll Slayers still up and running. You can see over here that the time that has brought them on this front line has allowed the 1st Legion Pikes, they've taken a fair amount of damage from the crossbows, but they've also managed to establish some real dominance on that frontline fight very quickly, dealing with the White Orcs and Black Orcs combined front line. More throwing projectiles being used as well. Cave Trolls and Drake Broodlings being used aggressively once more. I mean, even though they are armour piercing, Trolls are still probably one of the better ways to deal with the 1st Legion, but with the support around them, the Cave Trolls being slightly weaker, they should fall by the wayside fairly fast, I think. Arthedain Pikemen on the way forward. Reinforcements are all well and good, and they may be entirely necessary at this point. Drake Broodlings being used once more to try and disrupt the rhythm of a more concerted effort to push forwards. I think we can say one thing for certain. I was not sure how well the Drake Broodlings would do in this battle so far, but they've proven to be a very worthwhile addition to the defence. Very, very tricky thing for the attackers to have to deal with. Also Sons of the Fallen now moving forward. You can see that some more yardage is being made up by the attackers now. more and more quality. They've got the numbers of Cardolan to help them out over here as well. Keep the assaults looking a little bit fuller. And warriors of Khazad-Dum getting in behind enemy lines, going after the heavy goblin crossbows. Don't know if they had any ammunition left. If they do, that's a nice bonus, a nice little extra victory for the attackers there. Forward come another unit of Blackback Mountain Berserkers though. Still advanced party will struggle against them, but much the same sort of thing is happening to the Misty Mountains further towards the gate. Surrounded as they are by a lot of Elven and Dwarven quality, the Black Uruks are a very good unit for their price point, but they will be overwhelmed in terms of quality here. Obviously, no warriors trying to offer their services as well and support. Away garrison spearmen. All of those numbers will certainly be useful. Meanwhile, over here, the attackers are losing ground. The Misty Mountains once again pushing back. And now, I mean, plenty of high quality over here, I suppose. Guards of Khazad-Dum, a very, very scary unit for the Misty Mountains to have to face, especially with that armour piercing that they have in for the deal. Heavy Goblin Infantry are there as well. Dismounted Fornosterine Knights, more Pikemen, Mithril Guardiad. They can't afford to be too stingy at this point. I think that's been one of the issues the attackers have faced over here. Yes, there are only 2 armies of them rather than 3, so they're going to have less mileage in the tank, but I do think they've been trying to get away with committing a little bit, well, less units than really the situation called for. Yes, the crossbows would have been a problem if they'd done that, but the crossbows have been a serious issue for them anyway. And I think momentum would have been key here. But with the highest quality Khazad-Dum units now on the front line, in melee terms they should be fairly domineering, and I don't know if they have enough crossbow bolts left, the Misty Mountains, to maintain what they've been doing so far. A little bit of pike support from Arthedain as well certainly won't go amiss. More units pushing forward. Battered and bruised heavy goblin infantry. The blackbacks still on the front line are a nice enough addition, but they're already a little bit depleted, and individually they won't be a match for the highest tier Khazad-Dum units anyway. Weapons of the North reloading. The goblin crossbows are still firing away. The Misty Mountains still fighting over here. Still with some heavy goblin archers, interestingly enough, so not as deadly as the crossbows, but still more missiles that the attackers are having to deal with, and still the Misty Mountains are not keen on giving the attackers anything for free. Slowly but surely they are gaining ground, the attackers, but Blackback Berserkers, White Rook Fearmongers standing in the way of yet this latest renewed assault. Khazad-Dum Reclaimers in position. Unit of them that are out of ammunition already. I don't know. Elder Spearmen on the front line are all well and good, but too much of this is perhaps made up of Greenway units and bandits. Maybe a little bit more quality is needed on the front line in order for them to break through here. It is worth saying that those heavy goblin archers, with their rather poor accuracy, some of those shots were hitting the backs of their own units, so any bit of friendly fire would certainly not be appreciated. What do we have? Archers of Rivendell trying to return the favour. Snaga skirmishers, so trading back and forth with their ranged units. Snaga skirmishers having to get into melee is always, you know, it's fairly desperate hours when things like that are starting to occur. But over here, is that dwarven quality going to be enough? There's not much in the way of, on the mini-map, in the way of attacking units left. But maybe just about enough to scrape out a narrow victory. With that may end up being the case across the whole battlefield. Misty Mountains have done pretty well with some of their units, especially their specialty units and their crossbows, but could it be that the nature of a 5v3 and the kind of quality that the attackers still have left available to them, is that going to be enough to see them over the line as we enter the final 10,000 frames? Near enough, anyway. 3 hit points on those Mithril Guard proving to be a little bit too much by the looks of things. There's only 14 Blackback Berserkers remaining. There's less of the guards of Khazad-Dum than the Mithril Guard, so that 3rd hit point definitely showcasing its value once more. Heavy Goblin crossbows. Looping a few shots in. Badly bloodied, is it? Well, they're going to get through here, and there isn't really... Well, there's still one unit of Black Uruks that could be committed, I suppose. The rest is all crossbows, though. Heavy Goblin Archers are actually the thing they're shooting in now, so it's not even the same level of punch that they're having to rely upon to try and help shore up their defensive efforts now. Meanwhile, still some trolls actually, snow trolls as well. More units being pushed forward. Goblin King's Bodyguard, and actually the first example of Mountain Uruk host that we're seeing in this battle now. Ooh, and this will be why they've managed to get in and around the front line with their Minhiriath Spearmen. They're shaken while doing it, Cardolan, but it is completely crippling the defensive shape that the Misty Mountains had going on over here, and this is the sort of moment where you kind of get the impression that the attackers will have too much left. Even with the most minor victory over on the other side as well, the Misty Mountains are going to have 2 angles to have to try and account for. And I'm not sure whether pushing forward more men to try and deal with a situation that had already turned against them was necessarily the right thing to do. Mountain Uruk host will be able to beat Minhiriath Spearmen in a vacuum, but they're going to have a lot of support in and around them very, very quickly. And the Goblin King's Bodyguard nearby. They are going to be committed to the front line as well. Maybe for the second time, a doomed defensive effort is what the Goblin King's Bodyguard are going to be committed to over on this side of the battlefield. Archers of Rivendell, Minhiriath Sharpshooters, plenty of them. And that's the thing, Cardolan is still going to have access to quite a few crossbow bolts in the back pocket. So as much as they've been on the receiving end of crossbows for much of this fight, in the critically important late game, Cardolan is still going to have access to far deeper ammunition reserves than the Misty Mountains will at this point, combined with the level of quality that they're going to be pushing forward onto the front lines as well. You would worry for Misty. They've done well enough so far, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Meanwhile, over here, actually some White Throat Fearmongers that have been committed to the front line over here. That's fairly substantial. Offers them a Phalanx unit, which I don't think the attackers over on this side have anymore. The issue is going to be the shape of the engagement. Mithril Guard actually losing this fight now as a result of the armour-piercing polearms being brought into the fight. Arthedain having to commit forward a unit of their Dunedain Peacekeepers to try and keep their positive momentum going. Maybe it's not all that simple. Horns of the North probably just trying to get as many kills as they can, as some remnants of Goblin Skirmisher units are going to be pushed onto the front line as well. Still some more Dunedain Peacekeepers that can be committed onto the front line as well. I mean, if they can keep their formation going, that's another unit of Blackback Berserkers as well. There seems to have been so many units of Blackback Mountain Berserkers. I suppose the Misty Mountains are not an expensive faction, so going into the red limit in a 5v3 like this is easier for them to do than many others. And if there was a unit that you were going to do that with, it would be the Blackbacks. They're capable of doing damage even to the likes of Khazad-Dum and Imladris after all, so being able to fall back upon something like that is something that you're going to want. There's White Uruks though. Defeat is almost a certainty, struggling a little bit to maintain. I think the problem here is the White Uruks are not covering the whole line, so where they're not, the Dunedain Peacekeepers are starting to push in from the side, and also a few Khazad-Dum, or guards of Khazad-Dum, I should say. And that is proving to be a little bit of a problem. Yeah, and they are winning the attackers. More so over on this side, you would have to say. I think the fight on the other side is going to prove to be a bit more of a footnote, because the Misty Mountains are starting to spin their wheels a little bit more over here, and enough left in reserve. There goes a Misty Mountains general. I think we will be starting to head rather rapidly to the conclusion of this fight from this point on. The Misty Mountains have been fighting from the front throughout this entire battle, but this may be where things start to come unstuck for them. Archers of Rivendell still with plenty of ammunition left, and heavy goblin crossbows taking hits. Snaga skirmishers are running, Minhiri Spearmen once again rushing forward, perhaps to try and get into melee with the crossbows that are still firing at the attackers at this point, as they continue to swamp forwards. Still the small matter of units like the Gatekeepers which can be committed late on as well. The Bridge of Khazad-Dum, the Drake Broodlings getting in the way. Again, those spears actually should be pretty good. I do believe the Drake Broodlings count as cavalry, so an anti-cavalry bonus does help finish them off in melee. Those crossbows though, that blob, a very tempting target indeed. Snow trolls. And what is occurring over here then? It's looking, based on the minimap, fairly thin on the ground. Oh, I say that, the extra unit of Black Uruks has been committed, although this, I think, is going to be everything for the Misty Mountains over here. The closest reinforcements are the ones that are way over in the town centre, so this is going to be it in terms of resistance that the attackers will be meeting over here. And the Black Uruks actually enough to maybe make this battle in their favour, but as soon as those dismounted Knights of the Numinous are committed forward, that should be enough to tilt the battle once again in favour of the attackers. Like I said, probably going to be a minor attacker victory over here, but I don't think it matters too much, because I think it's going to be a more domineering victory over on the other side. Still well within the confines of what I would consider a close battle this, but as in typical MORIA fashion, it has been a grind, a real slugfest throughout the various choke points that it has available to it, though with how aggressive the Misty Mountains were from the start, it offered a little bit of a different tactic than what we normally see on this map. And of course, this being the last time that we ever see this map on this channel, that is worth bearing in mind as well. A farewell to old MORIA. There's some routing going on now. Decent quality of the Mountain Uruk host means that the lowly Cardolan units that were sent forward in the vanguard not really able to make too much progress. Orc hunters. Still the small matter of the upper tier dwarven units as well. We just saw the 1st Legion Pike starting to cross the Bridge of Khazad-Dum. No rest for the weary. As the crisscrossing of those crossbow bolts continues. Heavy Goblin Archers doing their best. They can't match their crossbow brethren for effectiveness of a supporting unit, but Misty Mountains need everything downrange. All units moving forwards, and again the attackers, I mean, in a different world, the attackers being fairly slow and sluggish and reinforcements being a little bit too far away, if things were different, that would be critical. It's the sort of thing which can lose you the game, but fortunately for them, they're going to have too much left in the tank here. Yeah, the dismounted Knights of Anunas came in here, and that is going to be enough to deal with the remaining Misty Mountains defenders over here. Forward come the remaining Wardens of the North. Unsurprisingly, they've been a target for crossbows up to now. 18 heavy goblin infantry. Turning back around to be tasked with trying to defend against the advancing army. Meanwhile, Mountaineer Coast, yeah, the level of quality now. Khazad-Dum Reclaimers and 1st Legion Pikes. A far more robust foe than bandits and battered Minhiriath Spearman. And that is going to be the end of this little rear guard as well, so they are at least going to try and cling on to the town centre, but it's not going to be anything that bears any fruit for the defenders, I fear. Guards of Khazad-Dum, the ones moving up here in the vanguard. I mean, the snow trolls will charge into them, but the armour piercing and the level of damage of the guards of Khazad-Dum should be enough to deal with the snow trolls, especially bloodied up as they are. Be interested to see how little time this takes, to be fair. One falls, several of them fall, yeah. As was expected, perhaps. Two of them moving a little bit further forward, but I mean, not really going to be able to do much of anything here. They're going to be able to get in the way, be a minor annoyance. But little more. Still those gatekeepers, 2 units of them. Several units taking the direct path. Excuse me. What do the Misty Mountains have left? I mean, not enough is what they have left. They've still got some White Uruk Fearmongers, but a lot of skirmishers that are out of ammunition. Not going to be able to hold on for too much longer at all. And we will go up to ×2 speed just to hasten things along a little bit. In fact, ×6 speed to start with. Routing units. More of a genuine assault this time. Khazad-Dum Reclaimers and 1st Legion Pikes flooding forwards. Again, there's no real need to stack up on each side at this point, because it's very clear who's going to be going on to win this fight. My voice is giving in, so I think this is going to be the last recording of the day that I'm able to do. Still a fair amount of damage being done by those crossbows, but Minotaur, Roman Gatekeepers, so damage being done by the attacking crossbows in response to that as well. And they will be getting involved on this side as well. I have to say, it's pretty much entirely Arthedain that are now attacking from the left-hand side of Moria. Khazad-Dum exhausting themselves against the defensive efforts of the winged swordsman element of the Misty Mountains army. The White Uruks are the ones that are over there trying to fight them off as well. And there's guards of Khazad-Dum also. Attempting to do the business, and they will definitely succeed against heavy goblin crossbows. I mean, they're in the town centre, so routing actually isn't going to be the sort of thing that you can induce, but still, Flaming Shot looks neat, and at this point victory is already secured. How you choose to finish your prey off is up to you. Heavy goblin archers And here we have sharpshooters utilising their maces. Again, multifaceted unit, as has been mentioned a couple of times throughout this battle. They won't be leaned on too heavily for their melee expertise, they're just here to join in on the fun. The White Oak Fearmongers far and away the strongest unit the Misty Mountains had left in the town centre towards the end, but nowhere near enough of them, and the support around them wasn't of the required number either. So in the end, a fairly domineering victory for the attackers. The late game, the quality started to win through, and the support for the Misty Mountains, which have been so important throughout the battle, started to run its ammunition supplies dry. And as soon as that happened, it basically coincided with the Misty Mountains starting to lose ground very, very quickly. In spite of a good opening and middle section of the battle the Misty Mountains had, it was the late game where truly all the damage was done to them. And the slightly slower approach of the attackers did not end up harming their efforts, but in the end it merely made the late game a foregone conclusion when they really started to get rolling. I don't even know what was left there, but yes, Khazad-Dum reclaimed with the help of the Arnorians and the elves from the west. And there we have it. So yeah, an interesting battle that from 2 times, and like I said, it's going to be the last time that we see this old version of MORIA on this channel, so nice as a little farewell to it, and obviously the Misty Mountains holding on to it initially but losing it, so we can say that Khazad-Dum have reclaimed it back for good. And as I was mentioning throughout the battle, it really did coincide with the loss really of their availability of their skirmish ammunition and such, which is a bit of a shame, because I do think that the Misty Mountains, especially in the earlier stages of the battle, were doing really rather well, and I do appreciate it when the defenders are willing to take the front foot and be a little bit more aggressive, and perhaps with their numbers the Misty Mountains felt as though they could be that way. But maybe in the end there was a little bit of an element of they were constantly willing to send men, or goblins I should say, forwards, but there was a point where maybe like retreating to a better position would have been a more advantageous thing for them, especially maybe using the bridge of Khazad-Dum, that sort of area, to really make better use of their crossbows over on the other side would have been fairly key. I think for winged swordsmen it would have been smaller things over on his side, because it was a very close run thing between him and his 2 foes. There were a few units from his 2 supporting armies as well, of course, but still that was a close run thing. But yeah, I think that would have been a bit of a difference maker, maybe a little bit more of a willingness to pull back into greener pastures, as it were, for the Misty Mountains, and then use stuff like their crossbows a bit more effectively. But one thing I will say, the Drake Broodlings, I wasn't sure about that pick, but in the end it did prove to be very, very effective indeed. So very well done to the Misty Mountains there, but in the end 5v3s are always going to be a little bit tricky. Like, the attackers didn't do too much wrong. I would say that they were a little bit stingy on occasion, and in a different situation on a map that's a little bit less forgiving for this sort of composition and this sort of focus that the attackers had against this kind of opponent as well, it could very well have ended in disaster, but on this occasion it was enough for them to see themselves over the line. So let's see what did the damage for the Arthedainian army. Dismounted Fornoster Rhine Knights doing quite well. The dismounted knights were only committed late on. The Troll Slayers were key, actually, when they were committed to the front line, both with their javelins and their axes. Definitely one of the opponents that the Misty Mountains enjoyed fighting the least. The Peacekeepers were a late game unit as well, and by the time they were committed, you could tell that the Misty Mountains were really running out of steam, and having a unit like the Peacekeepers coming your way when that's the case is not great for you. Civilians, not much. Marksmen, differing fates for them. The Warns of the North, not too much, but they would have been hand-picked kills, as it were. And most of them on heavy goblin crossbows, which isn't the most in terms of cost expenditure, that unit, but the crossbows were still the most important unit for the Misty Mountains, as I kind of expected. Drake Broodlings and Trolls were all well and good as well. Most of the high-end infantry for the Misty Mountains did its best, but in a quality fight against these kind of armies, it was always going to be difficult for them. So credit to the Misty Mountains, but ultimately I do think that the attackers didn't play, like, they played well. So in a 5v3, it's always going to be difficult for you as the defenders on a map like this if the attackers play well, because again, 5v3, it's not supposed to be balanced. It's supposed to be very surprising when you win a battle as the defenders in this kind of situation, and like I said, this old version of MORIA does kind of favour the way that the attackers decided to go about it. So yeah, big thank you to Two Times for sending this one in. It was part of a series of replays that he sent me. We've already seen, of course, one previously. I can't actually remember what map it's on. My mind is going completely blank. It's a sign that I've done too much Medieval 2 for one day. But yes, big thank you to him for sending this battle replay, and big thanks to all the players as well for being a part of this one. I think it was sent to me way back in like early November of last year, so we got there in the end, but other things sort of took precedence over this one, like custom scenarios and the like. But I do try and get to things in the long run, and like I said, with the new patch hopefully coming out at some point this year with a new version of MORIA, it was also very worthwhile to give a little farewell to this classic version of the map, which has been in ever since Vanilla Third Age, of course. As far as what's going to be coming up next, got another Siege free-for-all from the Womb Raider, which was actually sent to me even longer ago on the Arthedain outpost. So we're going to be seeing that one next. Following that, we're also going to be doing the Sword Cavalry or Melee Cavalry Knockout Tourney. So that's going to be coming up after that one as well. So that's what we'll have coming out in the next week or so. And following on from that, that's actually the full extent of my backlog for the time being. At least I think so. I'll have another quick scan over the replays that I've got in reserve, but I don't think there's too much else. So yeah, moving forward we'll see. I mean, at this point I'm like a month and a half ahead of schedule, so that would be why I've done big recording sessions and really caught up on all of the things that people have sent me. So hopefully I'll be able to record and render things as they come now, as opposed to constantly playing catch up. So that's the idea. But yeah, big thank you to Two Times once again. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.